It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. Here we have Mr. Keiselim Montás, who is yes, let's give him a round of applause. He's joining us from Dartmouth College, where he serves as Associate Director of Safety and Security. And he completed his graduate studies at the University of Cincinnati with my father, who's standing right there. So they were college or graduate school buddies together. Keiselim Montás has served in several capacities as a poet, as a short fiction writer, as an essay writer, and he has won several awards. Most recently, he won in February 2016 a very prestigious award called Letras de Ultramar, which is an award that is given to Dominicans in the United States who excel in a category of literature, like essays, poetry, fiction, and so on. And he won this prize in February of this year. So let's congratulate him. And additionally, he's a family friend, so we're very thankful that he's here this morning. And let's welcome him. Thank you for coming, Mr. Montás.
This is amazing that as Dr. Alvarado began speaking, he began speaking in Spanish, so vamos a hacer esto en español entonces. ¿Están listos? Really, thank you. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. Thank you, Dr. Alvarado. It's really amazing. I'm really grateful to be here. And I look around and it looks great. Coming from New Hampshire, it looks great, believe me. A little bit about myself. My name is Keiselim Montás, and I am 23 years old. No, I am really. When I turned 23, I realized that I didn't want to have any more birthdays. I realized that at that point that having birthday only contributes to making you older, not necessarily wiser or richer. It's like stopping here. So 23. But I have a couple of disclaimers. First and foremost, I speak fast. It's a tendency coming from the Caribbean. And the most serious disclaimer is that if by any chance you were to hear an accent, I promise you that it wasn't me, that it is not me, that is my story, that I'm sticking to it. And that if you have pictures or videos, I have a twin. Having said that, I want to jump right into my presentation, and I hope that I'm going to go fast. I have a lot to say. So that we have a little time to talk and exchange ideas if you have any questions. But what I intend to do is the following. These objectives that I have, that at the end, I want you to have something, taken something out of this. I'm going to introduce the term or the concept Transtierro. I'm going to provide you a historic framework of Spanish-speaking Caribbean and U.S. relations. That is the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. And I'm going to have to put on my glasses. I cannot see without them. It's part of being 23. I will give you a historical synopsis of the country's people's immigration to the United States. I'll introduce these new Latinos, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Dominicans, and take a close look at the immigration experience, options, and outcomes, and then give you a little personal history of myself as a Transtierrado. And I think I want to spend the bulk of the time speaking about the experience and the options of what happens when somebody comes to a new country, a new system, a new culture, anew. How does that process of adaptation, how does that person enters into the consciousness of their welcoming country? Come on in, guys, come on in, come on. It's only $5 a piece for being here at this time. Have a seat. And most importantly, how do we then enter the consciousness of the new culture and the new system? So let me begin by talking about Transtierro. There you go. So let's try and explain to you what this term Transtierro means, and I'm going to help myself by using the semantics of the word transatlantic. So here we have the Atlantic. Everybody with me? When you have something like this that goes from one side of the Atlantic to the other, then we call that transatlantic, which means that it's not on one side or the other. So it's across, sort of in between. When you are on one side, you thinking of the other side. When you are on the other side, you're thinking across on the other side and sort of in between. So if you think that of Transtierro, you talk about this condition that is between tierro, coming from tierra, territory, land, sort of being in between lands, on one side or the other, looking towards the other side, always in between. And this term was first introduced or used by José Gauss in 1943. José Gauss was a philosopher from Spain. He came to Mexico around 1939, 1940, after the Second Republic fell and gave rise to Franco and his dictatorship, which ended in 1975. But what Gauss meant by using the term Transtierro was that Spaniards came to Mexico and they sort of found a certain continuity of the things that they were doing. They were very welcome, same language. It was like taking a orange tree from Valencia and planting it in Guadalajara, and it just kept on sort of giving oranges, if you think of it. Which is different from what I mean. I mean more of that discontinuity and that in between. It's not the same process coming to a different country. So I like to think, on the other hand, that I use this term to mean bifurcation, rupture, by virtue of the clash between the old and the new countries, with different languages, cultures, systems, and even climate. And what the outcome is once that clash is somewhat resolved. I use it as a condition of identity to arrive at this new definition and meaning, which is as follows. Transtierro refers to that condition which defines those who are physically, mentally, or emotionally between lands, countries, homelands, homes, those who are in between, not on one side or the other. And we'll talk a little bit further about this. It is worth noting, though, that this is a condition of today's world, okay? The direct result of migration, which is what us humans have done throughout the history of the race for sustaining our existence in order to survive. We've always migrated. That's what we've done. So I want to also put that in the context of the idea of exile, okay? Transtierro happens as a result of a sought-after, even desired emigration, sometimes referred to as economical exile. That means that the person desires to leave their homeland and go elsewhere. Exile is more of a forceful expatriation, oftentimes politically motivated, where sometimes life and liberty are at stake. It is not the result of a desirable or willful immigration. Exile has that component of going back as soon as the political situation changes. And that makes it hard for the new immigrants to fully enter society and join the civil society life around them. Their focus, to begin with, is on returning. So where the person that migrates here wanting to come here, they want to come and make a life here. The person that is forced to leave their lands and come and seek for exile, their mind, for the most part, will be concentrated of going back. There is an expression that says that they never fully unpack the luggage. They always have that luggage behind the door. One day things are going to change, I'm going to grab it, and I'm going to go. However, exile might turn into transtierro, and this is depending on how long the stay is. Roots are developed inevitably. I tell you that in 1975, when Franco fell and there was no longer a reason to have exiles, Spanish people in Mexico did not pack up their bags and go back to Spain. It did not happen. Some of them went, came back, and ended up dying in Mexico. And we have the situation of the Cuban people. At this point in time, I guarantee you that this is going to be proven again. Once the conditions change, and they are changing, this is history in the making. Face it, President Obama was sitting watching a baseball game yesterday in Cuba. This is amazing. This is great, unprecedented. So things are changing, but what is going to happen when things do change is that I guarantee you that the Cuban people are not going to pack up and they're going to move to Cuba. But they are going to enter this back and forth. There is a recognition that has been happening, going back, visiting people where my grandmother was born, discussing here, discussing there, but it's going to go back and forth because they have now, by virtue of the length of stay, established that type of longevity or that condition of Transtierro. But let me go back to the idea that Transtierro is a modern world condition. And by that, I mean that we have modern modes of transportation which are quicker and more affordable. The highlight part over here, this is an ad from 1929. It says, Miami, the joint train to plane service out of the Florida East Coast Railway and Atlantic Coast Line and the Pan American Airways, Inc., brings Havana, Cuba, within 46 hours of New York City and effects a comparable saving of time between Havana and other cities of the United States. So, in 1929, it would take 46 hours to get from New York City to Havana, Cuba. Think of that. But in 1930, it will take a voyage of about 4 to 6 days, depending on the ship, to make it one way between New York and Havana. A round trip between Miami and the Dominican Republic in 1956 was $100, and the minimum wage at the time was $1, which is equivalent to about $8.29 in today's economy. So to buy a round ticket to go to the Dominican Republic, imagine working at least 2.5 weeks without eating, without paying rent, that sort of thing, just to have that. But it gets better. We have made immense advances in communication, and I mean by that computers, telephones, internet. Unprecedented advances. And let me tell you why. For you young people like myself in the 23 range, okay, you may not be aware of this, but listen up. In 1946, that was yesterday, literally, the first computer was turned on. It weighed 30 tons. It stood 18 feet high. It had 500 miles of wiring. And this is the best part. It could store 200 digits. Compare that. Telephones. In April of 1973, the first phone call on a cellular cell phone was made out of the Empire State Building in New York City. The phone weighed 1 pound, 14 ounces. The battery lasted about 8 minutes. And it did not hit the market until 1984. So until 1984, there were no cell phones commercially available. And at that point, it was still 2 pounds. And the price tag was $3,995. Think of that. Internet. In 1990, the first World Wide Web browser program was written. Prior to that, there was no such thing as the internet. Yet today, our world cannot do without it. I mean, 1990, how long was that? Almost my age, right? About 23, 26. Okay? What that means is that the world today is really small in comparison. Today, I read El Listín Diario from the Dominican Republic, the New York Times, and the Miami Herald while sipping my coffee in front of my computer on a snowy winter morning, sitting at my desk in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Not only does it allow me to be in the know of what is going on, but it also allows me to share my opinion right there. somebody writes an article, and I go, boom, I disagree with you, I think you know that, blah, blah, blah. I am here. Come on. I think you need to sign so that I send you the bill. Coming in, I have some seats over here, some over there, two over there, prime sitting over here. Good. There you go. So, come on. What this means is that, in comparison, a simple attack, simple assault of what I call nostalgia maldita, darn nostalgia, was not strong enough to have a Boricua jump on a trip to Borinquen, whereas today I can book a plane ticket from my office Friday morning, finish my work day, leave my office at 5, take a bus to Boston International Airport, fly to the Dominican Republic, spend the weekend there with my dad, sipping coffee and eating mangoes under my grandmother's tree in the backyard, and then be back on Monday sitting at my desk at 7 o'clock in the morning. So today's world and modes of communication allows me and allows us to be in constant contact and communication with the old world, with what we left behind, which back then it wasn't that easy. Even to read the newspapers, you have to wait sometimes 2 to 3 weeks to get the daily newspapers to arrive to find out what is going on back home. So this condition is indeed part of this new world. Now, we have to take a look at the Spanish, Caribbean, and U.S. relations in order to contextualize this. And I will tell you that this relation is over a century and a half. It goes back over a century and a half, as immigration from Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic has been characterized by various groups who have come to the land of Washington looking for better lives or looking to save their lives. Bear that in mind. But I will tell you that immigration has been sporadic and for the most part politically motivated. It's been marked in many instances by military intervention on the part of the U.S. I guarantee you the Dominicans haven't come over here yet in force. And then later is also marked by mass immigration. Sporadic and politically motivated is worth noting that the immigration due to political reasons, that is exile, was the initial driving force, and during the 19th century, political exiles were the bulk of immigrants coming to the U.S. from Cuba and Puerto Rico. They were fighting Spanish domination in the islands and went to New York City to launch their political campaigns. However, immigration from the Dominican Republic during this century, that is the 19th century, was almost non-existent toward the United States. The Dominican Republic was mostly involved in a nation or national identity fight, not a liberating fight. But few parents who could afford it will send their kids to study abroad, to sort of, as a way of exile, to save them from the menace of political repression. And those who were actively engaged in political activities will tend to go to Cuba, Puerto Rico, or Venezuela instead of necessarily to the United States. However, there are a few exceptions, a few cases here and there. It was marked by military intervention, particularly at the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th century. The first half of the 20th century is marked by U.S. occupation and interventions in all three nations, which will lead, again, to a new cause and effect type of immigration, as well as some conflicts of sentiments with the USA, looking at the USA as if you will, as the big bad imperio. We could take the Treaty of Paris of 1898 as a starting point, which ended the Spanish-American War, whereby Spain renounces ownership of Cuba and cedes Puerto Rico to the United States. Then in the later part of the 20th century, we have mass immigration. But to understand this mass immigration, I think we should take a little closer look at the different and various individual relationships. Let's begin with Puerto Rico and the U.S. Okay, so U.S. occupation in July of 1898, which led to the Treaty of Paris in December of that year. That was the first part, intervention, that thing. Then the Jones Act of 1917, which declared U.S. territory, which declared Puerto Rico as U.S. territory, which means that Puerto Ricans were now U.S. citizens. In 1952, Puerto Rico is declared as an associated free state, or the official name as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Both World War I and World War II had a role in this relation. As citizens, Puerto Ricans were subject to the draft, and they fought in both wars. That is worth noting. When we look at the relations between Cuba and the U.S., these have been the most tumultuous ones. There was U.S. occupation between 1898 and 1902, whereby Cuba was a U.S. protectorate. Then second intervention between 1906 and 1909. Third one between 1917 and 1922. There was a lot of political turmoil. There was a revolution in 1933, more turmoil. In 1934, Batista rises to power with the backing of the U.S. The revolution which brought Fidel Castro to power in 1959, and then all the backed military rebels to overthrow the Fidel regime, and the embargo that followed, and what is happening today, signifies that the relations between Cuba and the U.S. have been the most tumultuous one between the U.S. and the Caribbean. And today, of course, history is in the making. Unfolding of unprecedented changing relations as we speak. I mean, this is huge. This past weekend, the President of the United States went to Cuba in an effort to reopen up this relationship. So this is huge. It's history in the making. When we look at the Dominican Republic, we have interventions in 1903, 1912, 1914, occupation between 1916 and 1924. This occupation trained Trujillo, who then ruled the nation with an iron fist from 1930 to 1961 when he was assassinated. Then there was intervention again in 1965 to 1966, which brought about the government of Joaquín Balaguer, who was pretty much the shadow, the living intellectual shadow of Trujillo, and there was more repression that followed. I must tell you that during this occupation of 1916 and 1924, something interesting happened that tied us to Palm Beach. So, southern Florida was the tip of immigration going back. And usually, planes left from here, ships left from here. Apparently, there were a lot of soldiers from Palm Beach, or coming from here, going to the Dominican Republic. And dancing the merengue, which is the Dominican music, they'll kind of dance a little bit slower, with a little sort of thing to the side. So they began playing a type of merengue that they called merengue apambichao. Get it? Palm Beach, out in the style of Palm Beach. And still up today, when somebody plays a merengue, they say, I'm going to throw a pambiche there. They do this little thing that is related to Palm Beach. So there you go, another little part of the history. Let's take a look at these immigrants, or this wave of immigration that happened as a result of these relationships. The first wave of immigration from Puerto Rico happened between 1899 and 1901. The Treaty of Paris and the U.S. occupation of 1998. The first bulk, about 6,000 Puerto Ricans, went from Puerto Rico to work in the sugar industry of the United States. Guess where? In Hawaii. But what happened is, making the journey between the East Coast and the West Coast to go to Hawaii, there were little packets of Puerto Rican immigrants established all throughout. For the most part, they came to work in the agricultural industry. The second wave of immigration happened between 1917 and 1930. Again, with the Jones Act, Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory, and Puerto Ricans did not need any kind of paperwork. They were citizens of the United States. And also 1917 was as U.S. had entered into World War I. And I must sort of pause over here and say something. So Puerto Ricans didn't need any papers to come to the United States. Having said that, I will say that it was easier to leave the island as citizens. However, that did not make it any easier to live outside of the island as citizens or non-citizens. So unlike Cubans and Dominicans, they were citizens. They could just come and go as they please. That did not make their journey here and the transition here any easier by virtue of that. Most of the workers enter working industries in New York, in the New York City area. The Great Migration between 1945 and 1965, in 1952, Puerto Rico is declared an associated free state, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. World War II is happening, and then there are lots of incentives. There are ship flights, there is establishment of offices in New York City and other areas of the country to allow or enable Puerto Ricans to find housing, to find jobs, and to be part of the U.S. economy at the time. So there was some sort of incentive that provoked that huge mass. And for the most part, they came to work in the manufacturing industry in New York City. With Cuba, relations and immigrations, we have the U.S. occupation of 1898, 1906, and 1917. The Protectorate, the second and the third occupation, that established some sort of relationship and some part of immigration. Again, the political turmoil, the revolution, the Batista coming to power. But indeed, I will tell you that the Cuban Revolution produced the largest numbers of exiles or immigrants from Cuba to the United States. We have a number of waves, 1959 to 62, those who were initially opposed to the revolution, 1965 to 74, what they used to call the Vuelos de Libertad, established by President Lyndon Johnson. By that time, about 250,000 of Cubans have come to the U.S. In 1980, we have the famous Marielitos, about 125,000 Cubans came. 1993 to 95, we have the Balseros. That's due to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reduction of the Cuban economy by about 40%. And then, again, I'll mention that we had history in the making with unprecedented changing relationships between Cuba and the United States, and that is inevitably going to continue to this exchange. From the Dominican Republic, what we have is occupations in 1903, governments overthrown, this and that, 1912, 1914. The occupation between 1916 and 1924, I mentioned that Trujillo came to power, then occupation in 1965 that brought Balaguer into power. And then the period between 1981 and 1990 brought the number of Dominicans enter the United States legally to surpass all other countries of the Western Hemisphere except for Mexico. I mean, that is huge. The Dominican Republic is half a little bit of an island. Between 1981 and 1990, the highest number of legal immigrants entering the United States from any countries of the Western Hemisphere except Mexico were Dominicans. Amongst those is when I came in 1985. I know the math wouldn't add up. Being 23, coming here in 1985, math was never really my stronghold. Bear that in mind. But between 2010 and also during that time, there was an amazing amount of illegal immigration from the Dominican Republic to the United States. They will try to go to Puerto Rico, then come up. They will go to Canada. They will get into ships. They will do anything possible to come to the United States. So during that period at the same time, there was a tremendous amount of illegal immigration from the Dominican Republic to the U.S. Between 2010 and 2013, 55,000 Dominicans arrived in the United States. And as of November 2014, according to the census data, in New York City, Dominicans became the largest Latino group in the city, surpassing for the first time Puerto Ricans. About 747,000 Dominicans were in the in the 5 boroughs, as opposed to 719 Puerto Ricans. For the first time, Dominicans surpassed Puerto Ricans in the New York City metropolitan area. Now, these waves of immigration, these political or economical exiles, if you will lead to the New Latinos. And I want to introduce you this little excerpt of the New Latinos video from the PBS special that sort of talks about those 4 waves of immigration. So, let's see.
It was sudden because we had to leave in a hurry. My father was in the underground. It was kind of thrilling but scary because we realized the adults were so nervous because they didn't know if we were going to manage to get out. The plane kept getting delayed and delayed. Papi thought that maybe the secret police were going to come get him, get us.
Midsummer 1960. Julia Alvarez and her family were escaping the Dominican Republic and one of the most ruthless dictators in the history of Latin America, General Rafael Leonidas Trujillo. Dr. Eduardo Alvarez was on his hit list, and the Americans were helping him and his family to leave. The Alvarez family was part of a vast Caribbean migration, pioneers of a new Dominican wave.
We had some aunts up in the Bronx that had been here from the 1940s, but that was it. You know, it was mostly Puerto Ricans, some Cubans, but very few Dominicans. People, when we first came, they'd hear an accent. Where are you from? Dominique? You mean Dominique? I ended up solving it by saying I'm from the Caribbean. They knew where that was because that's, where people went for vacation. I'm from the Caribbean, It's like saying I'm from Africa, I'm from Europe, I'm from the Caribbean.
As they built a life in New York City, the family held on to the indelible memories of the nation they left behind.
Immigration means everybody changes. You have to be flexible, but certain things are important to hold on to because, this culture needs it. This culture needs certain things from us.
In the years after World War II, hundreds of thousands would come from Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and create new lives in America. Like so many immigrants before them, they would struggle, confront prejudice, and seize opportunity. Julia Alvarez would become an important American literary voice of her generation. An orphan boy from Puerto Rico would defy a segregated education and become a U.S. congressman. A Cuban man and his 2 sons would survive a perilous voyage at sea and contribute to the making of an American city. And the daughter of a sweatshop worker would win the highest honors on Broadway and in Hollywood.
Now, we talk about immigration. We talk about, there's relations that is certain, definite sort of paperwork, buying a plane ticket, jumping on the plane, getting on a ship, making the voyage, making it there. And then what really happens when a person first arrives to what represents in the short and long run a new country, a new culture, a language, they face many things, and there are many, many influential factors in the process of adaptation. How does that person becomes part of the consciousness of the host country, but more importantly, how does the host country enters the consciousness of the new person? And I want to sort of talk about some of these influential factors into what happened once the person arrives here. It's not that, you hear so many things, learn English, this is America. There are many things, but it's not, we don't have a switch that you sort of flip automatically. And now, think for a second. Bear with me for a second. Think that tomorrow, let's do the packing today. Today you pack your bags, and tomorrow you arrive in Russia, in Romania, in Argentina, in Italy, and you are there to start a new life. Parla italiano nessuno? Chi parla italiano qui? Bene, grazie tanti. Prego. Imagine that change, what is going to be to get started, to do that anew for a second. And I'm going to tell you, you're going to have a way easier time than they did prior to 1980, prior to 1990. You're going to have internet. You arrive in the Dominican Republic, half of the people speak Spanish. Speak English. You will not have that difficult of a time. Nonetheless, just imagine what happens. So let's take a look at some of the influential factors. When a person arrives first, okay, the level of education, their socioeconomic class or position, their age, the reasons for migrating, attitude towards the new country, occupation upon arrival, where they end up living, what plans they have for the future, and what distance and connections exist to that homeland. All of these are influential factors, and I like to give special attention to some of them and take a look at them. Let's begin with the level of education. The ones with a lower level of education go through the most difficult of adaptations, especially if they come here as older or already adults. Imagine how difficult it is for somebody who's illiterate as an adult in their own language to learn to read and write in their own native language. That is no easy task. Now try them to learn a second language when they don't even have the tools in their own language to begin with. So the level of education is extremely important. The higher the level of education, the more exposure, the more ability to adapt to the new language. Age is probably the most powerful factor. The younger the person, the easier will be for the adaptation. Childhood. Childhood. Those are the ones who would usually be educated monolingually in the new language, but will grow with the need to use one language for their social interactions with the world around them, outside of the home's door, and another language to talk to their parents, their aunts, their uncles, their cousins, their grandparents. They will have American culture in their surrounding and their parents' culture in their ears and at the dinner table. They will be the first ones to have to declare loyalty to two cultures, to two countries, neither of which might eventually fully recognize them. And I'm going to mention the case of Junot Diaz, who came to the United States at the age of 4. They said Junot Diaz today is a Dominican-American writer. They said the same thing about Julia Alvarez. Okay? Dominican-American writer, which means that he's not fully American, right? But you go to the Dominican Republic and they say, Junot Diaz, he's not Dominican. He doesn't even write in Spanish, which is not the case with William Carlos Williams, who's an amazing American poet. Everybody knows this American poet. Born and raised in Patterson, New Jersey. Puerto Rican mom. He is Puerto Rican. Never think of him as Puerto Rican American. So we have that thing. Next is teenage. Those who come who are already literate. So high school level perhaps, they go into school. They are not yet at working age. So when they arrive here, usually with their parents, they have to go to school, which was my case. They enter school. Those who come already knowing their native language and at school age will face the new culture and language right on, face to face. And they will be the first ones to whom the term Transtierro is applicable. They will be in between. They will become at once their parents' assistants in helping them navigate the new system, the new culture, the new language. They will be the translators at medical school, bank appointments. I remember going to high school to my parent-teacher conference, and I'm translating. They're talking about me. I was doing great. No, I was really doing great. they are immediately forced to jump on that bridge that navigates and connects the new and the old languages, the new and the old culture, the new and the old systems, the aquí and the allá, the here and there. They will most likely become, if they cultivate their native language, fully bilingual and fully bicultural. Adults, they are the ones who suffer the most. And this is directly proportional to their educational level. They statistically end up as the largest monolingual majority in the native language. But they are the first ones to also recognize the advantages of the new country and live, therefore, torn between the hopes of one day going back home, la retirada, packing up and moving back. But they also holding on to that person that they once were. The desire at the same time to have their children take full advantage of the opportunities this new country has to offer. They live torn between those two. The occupation that they get upon arrival is extremely important because they move from being a complete useful person to a system in which they are a mute, unknown nobody. You could be an engineer, you could be an architect, you could be a doctor, you could be a policeman, you could be a lawyer, and all of a sudden you end up in the United States where there is a new system, a new language, a new culture, and who are you? Imagine what happens to the identity of the individual. You find yourself over here being a nobody. Where they end up living also has great influence from arriving, for example, in Miami, in Washington Heights, in El Barrio, as opposed to arriving in Des Moines, Iowa, for example. It's completely different. You know, the first 5 years are usually the most difficult ones. And when you arrive, let's say, at Miami, they will be easier for the adaptation. Hey, you could find rice and beans everywhere. It's very, very important. When I lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, if you find plátanos, you were lucky, and you have to buy them by the pound. And everybody usually asks you what they were and how do you cook them. Same thing in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But what happens, depending on where you arrive, is that if you arrive at a place where it's going to make the transition easy, it's also going to make the transition longer. If you're able to survive those first 5 years, you take a person who came to Miami and you take a person who went to Iowa, and then they have to move and trade, unless the person who went to Iowa moved to Miami, the person who came to Miami moved to Iowa, guess what's going to happen? The person who first moved to Miami is going to have to start anew in Iowa. Like if they first just got there. It's going to be so much more difficult. Whereas the person will be able to make the transition to Miami or to Albuquerque or to Cincinnati or to Columbus, anywhere. It will be way easier. And then another thing that is important is the distance and connection between the two countries. The closer it is, and it happens for the Caribbean, the easier it is to go back and forth. You get that attack of nostalgia maldita, you jump on a plane, you're there. You know? And then you have your rice and beans, your concon, your tostones, and you jump right back and you're back at work. You couldn't do that in 1929. Who could afford to take 6 days to go one way and 6 days to come back, and then where you get the money? It was not the same. So this new condition allows us to be going back and forth and thus maintain that connection. But let's humanize this a little bit further to understand this phenomenon of immigration. When a person lands in a new cultural language, the individual goes into shock, literally, honestly, and into a crisis of identity. On the one hand, the person, language, and culture they know and knows them, vis-a-vis, being faced with this new cultural language and system as a person that no one knows and that knows nothing and no one. Let's see what Ariel Dorfman says about this. Ariel Dorfman is an Argentinian-born, Chilean expatriate, U.S. citizen, and a distinguished professor of literature at Duke University. So he's been around from one land and one culture to another. Can I have a volunteer to read this while I drink some water? I'll take away the $5 for. Go ahead. Okay, so that happens again, as I mentioned. You come over here, and all of a sudden you are a mute nobody. This crushes your identity. And how does one resolve this? And depending on those factors that we spoke about, education, where they end up living, how old they are, there are usually three outcomes. The first one is called the assimilation strategy. This crisis of identity, this bifurcation, usually has to be resolved. It needs to be resolved in order for the person to survive. So assimilation is when the person seeks to cut all ties with the past. They morph into an American. They change their name, they forbid the mother tongue, and undergoes a most painful transformation. And if with family, they will impose a dictatorship on them. You know, English only. I mean, some people change their name and dye their hair. That happened. That used to be the strategy at the turn of the century. That's why you have many Italian, Polish, Portuguese. Today, they don't speak any Portuguese, any Italian, any Polish. They have lost their root because they came and they merged. They acquire that other identity because it also happens to be a single identity. It's not bifurcated. It's not divided. It's single. It is whole. The next resolution is rejection, the one identity. The person consciously or unconsciously refuses to learn the new language, but the bare minimum to survive. Their hearts and minds are set in the old country where they hope to return one day to be the person they once were, which after time is simply impossible. They change, their country changes. It happens to me when I go back to the Dominican Republic. Sometimes I hang around with my friends and they begin talking and I was like, what are you talking about? Language changes. Sometimes I say things that are completely, people don't use those words anymore. Better yet, sometimes I don't have the language to say things that I have acquired in the new language. It's like, how do you say that in Spanish? I am clueless. Okay, so things change. We are no longer the person that we used to be, and that sometimes we might think that we still are. I will tell you that assimilation and rejection are the two strongest of drives, if you will, and they represent the single, undivided identity, the monolingual identity, and they are the streams. Again, assimilation used to be used before almost as imposed by the government. Now, I mean, everywhere you have Spanish, you know, they call you in Spanish from your bank. Before that didn't happen, they will call you in English. So before, this idea of assimilation was really imposed forcefully. We since have become more appreciative of diversity and see the advantages of bilingualism and biculturalism, if you will. And ultimately, you have the bilingual identity or the linguistic transtierro. The person is bilingual, living in two dimensions, pledging alliance to two cultures, two languages, inhabited by both, and living in between. One can say that this means mastering both cultures, both languages, both countries, both systems. But I tell you that it comes at a high price. I am no longer Dominican. And, as you probably noticed, all I need to do is open up my mouth. People hear me speak, and the first thing that they say is, "Where are you from?" Which implies that I am not from here. Automatically implies that. But I tell you something a little interesting that happened to me in terms of that in identity. In New York City, nobody questions who I am, where I am from. Oh, New York City, that's what happens. When I arrived in Cincinnati, for the first time, I was asked, "Are you white or black?" When I arrived in Albuquerque, in the Southwest, people looked at me and I kind of, you know, I looked like Chicano. I could blend in, you know. And then, whoa, where are you from? Was the next thing, because although I looked, I did not speak like. So that question of identity is constant and it happens. And it's something that we sort of need to deal with and master. Now, how is this manifested in these new Latinos? What I like to do is to sort of give you some examples of how this assimilation the one or the other, or the bilingual effect has happened, and how we have sort of become to enter in the American consciousness, or how the American consciousness has entered into us by just citing a couple of examples, okay? So, from Puerto Rico, we have Lourdes Vázquez, Tato Laveira, Lin-Manuel Miranda, Germán Badillo, Sonia Sotomayor. Let me tell you who these people are. Lourdes Vázquez is an award-winning poet, was a librarian at Rutgers University in New Jersey. She speaks perfect English. She writes in Spanish. She chooses to be translated. Tato Laveira was the leading voice of the Puerto Rican poetry movement in New York City, and he used to write in English, in Spanish, and in Spanglish. Lin-Manuel Miranda is really hot right now with his play Hamilton. He's been in the White House a couple of times rapping. His play In the Heights, a Puerto Rican talking about living in the Heights as a Dominican. Germán Badillo, who's mentioned in the video, was the first congressman from Puerto Rico to the United States in 1973. Sonia Sotomayor, U.S. Supreme Justice, Puerto Rican, and she's not ashamed of saying it. I mean, in one of their socials, she broke all rules. She got one of the judges to try to dance salsa with them. So you could imagine. From Cuba, we have Jose Coser, Achi Ovejas, Richard Blanco, two presidential hopefuls we just had. Okay, Jose Coser is one of the most important poets in the Spanish language today. He happens to be my mentor. I happen to have seen him yesterday. Achi Ovejas is an amazing translator, and she writes in English, but she's fully bilingual. But she usually translates those who write in English into Spanish and back and forth. Richard Blanco, the inaugural poet, whom I happen to have met, and I interviewed him in regards to this. And Richard told me, it's like, growing up, I will see my dad in the front yard with the newspaper talking to the neighbor about what is going on in Cuba. And I was convinced that at some point he was going to turn around and say, Rich, back up, we're leaving. We're going back to Cuba. It was always that idea of going back. On the Dominican side, we have Reina Espaillat, Junot Diaz, Julia Alvarez, whom you saw, Thomas Perez. Reina Espaillat is a woman who came in 1939 at age 7, became an amazing poet. At age 16, she was published in the American Journal of Poetry. She is today the most prominent translator of Robert Frost's poetry, and she writes what she calls agua de dos ríos, water from two rivers. She writes in Spanish, she writes in English, she translates. Junot Diaz, whom you might know, Pulitzer Prize winner, Julia Alvarez, whom you saw, Tomás Perez, who's the Ministry of Labor. And believe it or not, I just got wind of this. He might currently be considered as a running mate for Hillary Clinton as a vice president. Dominican, first generation. So this is sort of how we are now present in the American consciousness, but how the American consciousness is present in us. And so that we have a little bit of time for Q&As, if you have any, I'm going to move to sort of put this into the context of my personal history. Once again, do not do the math, you'll be wrong. I'm still 23. I came to the United States from the Dominican Republic at age 16 back in 1985. Now, let me tell you how that happened. I come from a rural, small town. My house, there was no TV, there was no fridge, there was no stove. There was one public telephone in the town at the gas station. And then one May 26, 1985, I landed in New York City, the capital of the world. Think of that for a second. So, my introduction to English. My cousins have been living there, so I went to their high school, and the guidance counselor wanted to see which ESL level he was going to place me in, for which he gave me a little test. So he looked at me and he said, "Where were you born?" Where were you born? ESL 1. Now, from ESL 1, I moved to ESL 3, and I entered as a sophomore. By the time I was a senior, I was taking a regular English literature class designed for non-native speakers. I ended up being salutatorian for my graduating class of 658 students. I'm patting myself in the back so that you know. 658 students, and we had an amazing bilingual program at my high school. We have 52 different nations represented at the time. But I'll tell you 2 little stories in high school, okay? It wasn't cool to be a kid learning English or with an accent. And that was manifested in a couple of ways. My first class in English was chemistry, which is by itself not an easy subject. And I used to say chemistry because that's how it's written. And I have to be thankful to my high school teacher, Mr. Shasnov, who will constantly call on me, and I will struggle here and there, but I usually got the answer right. But then I had to deal with Alex, who was from Russia, and Alex was a really big, intimidating guy. And he already spoke English, so he will tend to make fun of me and pick up on me because I was always raising my hand and talk with this funny accent. Then there was Robert from Ecuador. We had choir together. And Robert will not let it go. He will stand in front of me and shout, "Speak English, goddammit!" all the time. And then there is Mabel, or Mabel. She was from Honduras. And I was madly in love with Mabel. What we call in Dominican, aficiado. She never paid any mind to me, paid no attention to me. Of course, I wasn't cool. I didn't hang out with the cool kids. I was in the transition between the two. And didn't see Mabel. So I lost track of Mabel as we moved school, grad school, so on and so forth. Then around around the year 2000, I'm in downtown Manhattan by the financial district, and guess who I run into? Oh my God. I had like this shock of electricity come from over here, like all the way down to here like that. I think I did a little sweating, but I just went right up to him and I said, "Hi, Mabel, remember me? I'm Casey." And guess what she said? "Oh my God, you speak English now." And that is how I got introduced to the English language. Now, my relationship with language, I have always had a very interesting relationship with language. I have always known that language is the most powerful of human abilities. So, words like contrast, surface, permeable have always fascinated me. And I sort of began working with language, learning the new language. I decided to keep a journal in Spanish so that I could keep my language alive, and I tend to write in Spanish. I have a number of books published in Spanish, plans to get them published in English. We'll see if I will write them in English or if I will translate them. We don't know yet. But I tell you, because of that fascination with language and using language as a tool, I landed in high school a scholarship to go to Columbia University to study English because I wrote in an essay, I used the word surface to compare the subway as to public transportation in your city. I say I like surface transit because in the bus, it's like a big window. You're looking at the city like if you are in a big theater, unlike when you are in the subway. And they were fascinated by the use of the word surface. So I got the scholarship. But it also means that I do speak with an accent, and I am cognizant of that, and I try to write and reflect that in my writer. So I consider myself a good writer, but it has its consequences. I used to work in New York at a company in which anything that you write had to go to the vice president for administration to be checked before it gets approved or sent out. And I began noticing that I will send out a memo, and before it gets approved, the memo will come back to me with a comma, maybe one S here, something really minor. And I will correct it, send it back. And a minute later, the vice president will send out a memo, and I look at it, and it had at least 27 errors. So I took one of those, red pen, I marked it, and I marched into the administrator's office, and I say, "Please explain this to me." I will tell you, he wasn't being malicious, okay? But they hear me, and they immediately think that that is what is happening. But what is in actuality happening is that accent is having an effect on their brain, not on mine. They are the ones who are writing with an accent in that respect. And what ended up happening is that after that, the vice president will not, as a matter of fact, nobody in the department will write anything that wasn't checked by me afterwards. So that's what ended up happening. Issues of identity and how I am perceived. Again, I mentioned the idea of what happened in Cincinnati, what happened in Albuquerque. The minute that I say something, immediately my identity becomes part of the equation, and it comes into question. My literary production, as I mentioned, is in Spanish. I have 3 volumes of poetry, 1 volume of essay that just came out, and actually my volume of essay is called Transtierro, and it actually talks about this experience and most of the things that I have spoken about. And I just won, as Dr. Alvarado mentioned, a contest of essay, and the book is about to come out now at the end of this month or at the beginning of the other one, and again, it's essays. And then my identity, what can I tell you? My identity is based on the need to be understood in both languages as the person that I am, a person who lives on that bridge, on that condition called Transtierro, that connects his 2 countries, cultures, languages, and history, a person who's bifurcated, bilingual, bicultural, permeable, hybrid, with a then and here, and aquí and allá, a here and now, ahora y antes, and with the desire and ability to stand up and defend this nation and its ideals of justice, freedom, and democracy in at least 2 languages. Thank you very much, and I will welcome your questions.